Hey, good morning, everybody. If everybody go ahead and start finding you a place to settle. We're excited that you're here. We are finishing up today a series that we've been on for a couple of months. The wall has been finished, but we've got one more little something to cover about Nehemiah, and then I guess next week we'll have these boxes down, unless somebody may need those boxes. I guess you can take a box with you today if you need a box. How about that? That's your parting gift. Well, I'll sell them to you, Ellis. No, I'm joking. Oh, man, is that thing whining? Are y'all hearing that? Is it just me? All right. Hey, listen, we have got a handout today, and this is all 20 building blocks. We've talked about over the last 8 weeks. Some of you I know have written them down. Some of you are like, blocks, what are you talking about? It doesn't matter to me. I just wanted you to have them if you wanted them. Maybe you can share some with your neighbor, or one per family, or per couple, or however you want to do it. We'll make about 80, and we'll just pass them around, get them going. And you may or may not need one, that's fine. But I didn't want to have our last class on this series and not offer all 20 building blocks that we've covered. We'll actually cover the last two today. We'll get there eventually. But before we get started, I want to give one big plug. Now we're gonna do it during the service. You're gonna watch a video today about Run to the Cross, but I want to give one good plug for it in here, because I know this class is really good about supporting things that the church does. So it's this Thursday night, this coming Thursday night, the 6th. It's in our parking lot here at church. Registration's at 4:30. And Denise was telling me before class that each year they like to have one really big project. They do lots of things. The money goes to lots of different places, but each year they try to have one kind of major project they work on. And it's this year they're trying to get enough money to build a girls' home of refuge in Haiti. So that's what this year's main project will be. And I just found out, actually, from talking to David as well, there's going to be an extra race as part of the night. David said that he and I are doing a 1-mile race. And I know Russ is going to get in and be a part of that. Russ will be the judge, shoots the gun off. Me and David are going to have a 1-mile race, and that'll be some extra pros. I'm joking. David can race anybody he wants to race. I'm not going to do that, or I'll wind up in the hospital. But yeah, man, this is a great event, wonderful thing for the last 13 years, right? Last 13 years. So Thursday night, come out and support that here at church. All right, we got those sheets around. Like I said, we're going to cover the last two items on that list today, but that's all the different statements. I just wanted you to have that. And I want to say this. Remember, this is not a perfect list. This is not, well, if I do this, then I'll have the greatest organization on the face of the earth. No, that's not what's about. But it is a list that is Bible-based on the story of Nehemiah. All right? That's what it is. These different statements on this sheet would hopefully help you serve in any capacity as a leader. And it's interesting, the conversations I've had over the last 8 weeks, when people come in and say, "Man, I can't believe you said that. I know you were talking to me," and the person works at a school, and or somebody says, "I know you were talking to me," and they own a business here in the Shoals. "Well, I know you were talking about me," and they're involved here at Crosspoint. I'm like, I'm not really talking to any particular person. We're just taking the story of Nehemiah. And if you're a coach, a teacher, a principal, a parent, a president, or an owner of a company, a manager, a church leader, I don't know who you are in all of that. But hopefully some of this can help you. There's no one set pattern that's going to fit every group. But here's the thing. We cannot forget the guideposts that the Bible gives us. Okay? And I can tell you this because, like, you've got your John Maxwell's and Andy Stanley's and Dave Ramsey's and Jim Collins and all these different people, and you read leadership books about, I promise you there are biblical principles attached to all of the stuff they do. I mean, a lot of those principles come from Scripture. And what happens a lot of times, we begin to lean more on what we think than what God thinks. Well, I think it'd be a good idea if we... I think Scripture shows us a good idea would be. Would that not be a better way to answer questions or to make decisions? In your company, in your organization, in your school, in your wherever you serve, okay? And so that's just a quick introduction. We have been all over the place. I want to give us a couple of quick reminders to get us up to today's material. We're going to be in Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah 13, that's where we're going to end up. 2 weeks ago, we said the end, it's number 17 on your list, the end of a God-ordained vision is God. And what we said is God always reveals himself in the midst of a vision that he authored. What we saw happen is an amazing story in Nehemiah chapter 8. They've been all over, man, they've been working and building and doing about this wall. And when it's finally completed, we had all these lessons where I felt like we were talking about Sanballat and problems and Tobiah and complaints and issues. Well, the wall gets finished. And the people just on their own, okay? It's not Sunday at 10:30, let's go to the rock. On their own, the people begin to gather together in this big open area, and to be together, and they bring out Ezra, and he begins to read the Word of God to them. And they begin to weep. It's emotional. And it's like they have this huge worship service like we're going to have in the Rock Wednesday night. Man, if you like to sing, if singing is even like a 2 out of 10 for you, you need to be in the Rock Wednesday night, all right? I know I'm overselling it. I can't believe we got Keith Lancaster coming. Where'd Chase go? How'd he pull that off? Keith Lancaster's going to be leading Wednesday night. Man, it's going to be good. But that's kind of what they were having in this story. And what happened here is we begin to see a point that I'm telling you, I have missed. I missed this. We taught this same material 8 years ago in this class, 8 years ago. And I missed this. I missed this whole point that this story isn't about a broken down wall. The story is about leading the Jews back into a good relationship with God. That's the story. And somehow I missed that 8 years ago. Because if you can fix the wall, but if you don't fix the relationship with God, then what have you got? You don't have anything. And so, again, I'm not talking to any particular person when I say this, but I need to make sure, listen, if you can have a vision and you can get things going in a right way in your organization, but if you don't fix the relationship with God, with your people, then what have you got? Are you getting that? That is a huge, you say, man, what's the book of Nehemiah about? We all go, well, the wall. It's about the wall. You know, Mark's got those boxes up in his, it's about fixing the relationship with the people with God. Make sure you don't miss that. And that's what happens in chapter 8. Then last week, we got into block number 18 that's on your sheet. Maintaining a vision requires an adherence to a set of core beliefs and behaviors. And that's a real bunch of fancy words for you got to stick to a standard. You have to stick to a standard. We mentioned several companies from a Jim Collins book. Marriott, 3M, Boeing, Sony, Walt Disney. And Jim Collins said, man, what makes them visionary? Why are they visionary? How do they stay on top year after year after year? And he found lots of different things, but he said one of the common denominators that came out was they had an uncompromising commitment to a set of core values. And what our challenge last week was, do you have that? Do you have that with your team, in your company, with your organization? Do you have an uncompromising commitment to a set of core values? And we talked about how unity can only be maintained when there's an agreement. So you can say, yeah, we've got that. Man, my entire management team, we are committed to a set of core values. And maybe you've got 200 employees that are not. You see what's going to happen. That's not good. That multiple core beliefs equals division. And I'm not saying they're not good people. I'm talking about your organization, okay? If you have multiple core beliefs, things are not going to go smooth. So Nehemiah, after this whole big throwdown worship service with Ezra and Keith Lancaster, I don't know if he was there, but man, it was some serious worship going on. After all that ended, they said, man, we have got to come up with a set of standards that we're going to follow, some core beliefs. And so they literally write a contract between the people and God. This is in chapter 9 and 10. This is the last thing we talked about. They pledged their devotion to God. The leaders signed it, and all the people took an oath swearing to uphold it. It required them to take some radical steps in their relationship to foreigners, their respect for the Sabbath, and their care of the temple and the priest. And so we ended last week with that, all right? And this is crazy what's about to happen. Okay? Core belief, standard. Man, we're for it. We're worshiping. It's all good. But then we've got to get to these last two building blocks, all right? I'm going to read you a couple of different sections from this book that we've been kind of using to help us get through this. This last chapter starts with this. Leading people is difficult. Anybody want to amen that? Besides Tim? Leading people is difficult. Whether you're a single mom leading your teenage son or a CEO leading a corporation, leadership is difficult. People don't act right. This is Andy Stanley talking, so if you don't like any of this, you can call him over in Atlanta. I don't think you'll be able to get through to him, but you can give him a call. They keep coming up with impractical ideas, and they have a hard time seeing past their own most pressing needs. There's no autopilot in the enterprise of visioneering. Sustaining a vision's forward motion requires the visionary's constant attention. Preserving the integrity of a vision demands that the navigator be fully engaged. Now look, we're fixing to throw Nehemiah under the bus. Y'all ready? Man, we've been like holding this guy up. And man, Nehemiah did this, and he told Sanballat this. And he said, due to no fault of his own, this was the one principle Nehemiah violated. All right, you ready? So here's what we're going to get into. I want you to remember, this all starts years and years earlier. Nehemiah is just a lowly cupbearer to the king, and he had a concern about his people and the walls that had been broken down for over 100 years. After everything is completed, they got our contract, all right, our standard, and then he's got to go back. Do y'all remember this? Remember, if you go back and look at chapter 2, verse 6, the agreement was when the wall's done, he's got to go back being a cupbearer. Now think about that for a minute. And we don't really know how long King Artaxerxes, the ruler of Persia, intended for him to be gone, but we know that Nehemiah stayed in Jerusalem for about 12 years. I think, I want you to picture that. 12 years that he stays gone. And he's doing all this stuff and leading all this stuff. He's the governor of the region. And I want to say this. This is a side note. This isn't in any book I've read. This is just Mark Killen. I think that shows the kind of leader he was, because he honored his commitment. If you'd been the cupbearer And then now for 12 years, you're the governor of the region, and everybody looks to you, and everybody does what you said, and you're pretty important. How tempting would it be to say, nah, I'm going to go back and be the cupbearer. Psh, get somebody else to do that. He goes back. He goes back to Persia. And so when he leaves, listen to this. This is what all's happening. The law was being read in the square on a regular basis. That big church service that we're talking about that happened back in chapter 8, that begins to just become a regular thing. The Word of God is being read on a regular basis. There was an eagerness among the people to sustain a spirit of submission to God. The people are like, man, they are in tune with God. The temple has now reemerged as the centerpiece of the society. Everything's good. You got it? Are you getting the picture? Nehemiah, I think, even though he may not have wanted to leave, I feel like he probably felt good about leaving. He's leaving it in a good place. Have you done that? Have any of you been a part of an organization and maybe you thought, okay, man, my time here is up. I think I'm leaving it in a good place. I'm selling the company, I'm turning over the CEO job, or I'm whatever. And you're like, I think things are pretty good. I'm going to leave it. I'm leaving it better than I found it. Right? Well, that's what's happening here. Here's what I want to think. Y'all can agree or disagree with me. I think excuse me, my voice is changing. It happens again around 53, in case you're wondering. If he'd been able to stay in Jerusalem, isn't it reasonable to assume that he would have continued demonstrating the kind of encouraging, inspiring, the attentive leadership he had shown, right? It's reasonable to assume if Nehemiah had stayed, he'd have kept doing what he'd been doing. That's a fair thing. But here's the thing. He's a lot like this guy. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Frank Blake. Anybody know who that is? I doubt anybody's going to know who he is. Frank Blake. He was the CEO of Home Depot several years ago, for 8 years. This is such an interesting thing. I felt like I had to share it because I think somebody, when they hear this, they're going to start doing it. I'm tempted to, but I'm bad to commit to do something and then not do it. In the 8 years that Frank Blake was CEO for the Home Depot, he's a Nehemiah kind of leader. He says that one of the most important things he did was not only communicate, listen, here's what he did. He communicated the company's vision. He turned the company around at one point when it was not going in a good place. He communicated the company's vision. He personally lived it out. Everybody listen to that. Any kind of leader you are, I'm not picking on you, but if you're a leader, you need to communicate your vision. You need to personally live it out. And then he celebrated it. You get those three things that he did? You're like, oh, it's Home Depot, Mark. What's that? Okay, whatever. He took a multi-million, maybe billion-dollar corporation and turned it around by doing that. For Frank Blake, here's what he did. One of the things he did, he took time and effort to sit down with paper and a pen, and he produced handwritten notes for about 100 individual employees each week. Did y'all hear that? This is the CEO. This guy probably could hire 9 people to do that for him. Y'all understand? But he did it himself. These were men and women who had been caught doing something particularly commendable that reflected the company's mission to be the best customer service retailer in the world. So he had people all throughout the organization that kept him regularly informed about these kinds of actions. Hey, Frank, there's a guy named Joe over here at this store, and he did this. And there's Sally over here at this store. Man, you won't believe the extra mile she went and did this. That all got back to him. Now, think about this. Y'all know how these big companies work. We might not can get this kind of information spread to a company here in the Shoals that's got 15 employees. This is a company that's got tens of thousands of employees. And hey, man, did you hear what Tim did the other day? And that gets back. And man, I heard Ed, the other day, I heard that Ed did this. And that gets back. And so Frank writes, y'all get how much? If he works 7 days a week, is that 15 a day? 14 to 15 handwritten notes a day to his people. He was tapping into the power of recognition. And those many thousands of notes over time helped root the celebration of excellent customer service into Home Depot's corporate culture, so that eventually handwritten notes were happening throughout the breadth of the company. Division presidents, regional vice presidents, district managers, store managers were all writing notes. You're like, man, Mark, how many of you have gotten a handwritten note this year from somebody? And it made you feel just I mean, you don't have to raise your hand and admit it, but it made you feel just a little bit good, didn't it? They noticed whatever was going on, and it might not have meant anything in the scheme of things, but it made you feel just a little bit better, didn't it? So imagine a company like this where now thousands of notes are being written by everybody in the organization. That's the kind of leader Nehemiah was. If he'd have stayed in Jerusalem, I believe the good effect of his hands-on leadership would have caused that kind of environment. But he had to go back to Persia. So, that gets us to chapter 13. After a time that he'd spent in Susa, I think maybe that's the capital of Persia, I'm not sure. But he's in Susa and he's back. He's the cupbearer again. He's back to what he was doing. And he said in chapter 13, verse 6, he asked to go back and check on Jerusalem again. Once again, the king was gracious and allowed him to go back. So now think about how this time he's going back. We talked in depth about the first time he went. What he was going to see, what he was going to experience, getting there and seeing the walls broken down and how bad. What's going through his mind this time? I want to think he's excited. I can't wait to get back and see, man, the people, I can't wait what's going on. I can't wait to get in that square and hear one of those Bible readings and have one of those worship services and see how the people are, man, they're celebrating the Sabbath and the temple's going good. I just can't wait to get back. Things had gone south. Building block number 19 on your sheet is visions require constant attention. So here, what's up? What's up in Jerusalem? Here it goes. Oh my goodness. They signed a contract. What in the world? The men who maintained the temple had not been given their food allotment, chapter 13, verse 10. You're like, well, what? Okay, we're talking about this culture for them. The men who maintained the temple were not being given their food allotment, so they had no choice to quit doing what they were doing at the temple and go home and work to try to earn money for their food allotment. I mean, there's a principle there in the New Testament about something about muzzling that ox and the corn or something. I think that's what justifies me getting paid to work here. But anyway, so these guys had to go home. So the temple now is in disarray. Oh, but the temple was supposed to be the centerpiece of what was happening. So the respect for the Sabbath was gone. And by the time Nehemiah arrives, it says in chapter 13, verse 16, it just become another work day. It's just another day of the week. The men from Judah were marrying foreign women again. Chapter 13, verse 23. Man, those foreign women. Whew! What in the world? And their children were being taught the traditions and customs of their mothers. I mean, we can say whatever we want, but that, the mothers are actually the ones in charge of everything. And so, verse 24, that's what's going on. All right? It's like the 180-degree opposite of everything that we said was happening when he left. It had already deteriorated back. So what do you think his mood was? Is he happy? This is awesome. No, it's not awesome. It's kind of scary. Andy Stanley says he does what every competent visionary does when a vision veers off course. He exercises bold leadership. He gets the priests back, and he rebukes the people about the Sabbath. Well, let's just read it. Look at chapter 13, verse 25. You ready? Now listen, let me go ahead and give you a little, you know how sometimes when you watch a TV show and like a little thing comes that says viewer discretion is advised? Viewer discretion is advised, all right, for Nehemiah. You're like, well, Mark, he said we're supposed to go. Now, I'm just going to read to you what Nehemiah did when things got off course. Chapter 13, verse 25. Take a look. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. Now, I am not recommending that you go into your office tomorrow, and if things have sort of veered off from the vision, I'm not necessarily saying this is bold leadership for 2022. Okay, you probably will get sued and be put in jail. But this is what Nehemiah did. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. And he calls back something to their history. Okay? Just like I might, or Frank, as a former history teacher, does a good job. He will weave a historical reference into one of his sermons, and all of us go, oh, yeah, I know exactly what he's talking about when he says that. That's what Nehemiah does here. Verse 26, was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? He brings Solomon back to him. Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? Man, he lets them have it. I'm just trying to picture these. I'm picturing that scene. Are y'all? Nehemiah must have been a tough dude, right? I mean, did he look like an offensive lineman or something? I mean, he beat the men down and pulled their hair out. Crazy. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of things that I really want you to listen to. Nehemiah draws a line in the sand. We're not hair pullers, all right, in 2022, but we've probably got our own version of that in your company or in your team or on your team. Listen to this and see if you have ever experienced this. Two statements. When someone takes a moral stand in an atmosphere of declining standards, it will appear as extreme to the one whose behavior is being called into account. Did you get that? When someone takes a moral stand in an atmosphere of declining standards, it will appear as extreme to the one whose behavior is called into account. And you're thinking, what? Let me give you a real life example that maybe you've experienced that I did in the past with different ones of my kids. If you've parented a middle school or a junior high kid, I'm not getting into what time you give your kid a phone, that's your business. But in our house, it was around that time. And if you begin to see that young person spending too much time on their phone and their grades go down the toilet, they're all, hey, I don't have time. I can't eat. I can't talk. I can't do. For you, as a parent, you would have reduced phone time, correct? And you would say that's a no-brainer. That is a logical step to take. Because they have spent so much time on their phone, they're not studying, therefore their grades went from A's to C's. You would say, give me your phone. Is everybody in agreement? That's probably what we would have done. Okay, thank you. But what does the teenager think? Oh my goodness! My life's over! What? No! You're ruining my, oh, I promise I'll study. I'll do better. I'll get my grades back. Please don't. Your decision would seem to be extreme to them. Does my previous sentence now make a little more sense? When somebody takes a moral stand in an atmosphere of declining standards, it will appear as extreme to the one whose behavior is being called into account. That's what Nehemiah had to go in here and do. I'm sure there were people here in the Jewish community in Jerusalem who would have thought he was being extreme. You may be reading it and you may be thinking he's being extreme. Here's the second. I told you there were two statements. Here's the second one. Let's get it on the table. A call for extensive change will always seem extreme for those who are comfortable with status quo. You get that one? Put that one with the first one. A call for extensive change will always seem extreme for those who are comfortable with status quo. If Nehemiah hadn't have come back from Persia, aren't we to assume that the Jews who had already said, well, who cares about the Sabbath? I'm going to work anyway. Who cares about the temple? Let them guys fend for themselves. I'll marry who I want to marry. Isn't it safe to assume they're comfortable? They're doing it. They're comfortable with that. They're just going to keep doing it. But Nehemiah comes in with extensive change, and so therefore that seems extreme for these people. Here's why. Visionaries are going to see things differently. If that's what you are in your organization, if you're the visionary, you're going to see things a little bit different, and you may be called on the carpet for it by the people. They're going to think, wow, that's the most extreme thing I can't believe they're. Let's finish this up. We got 8 minutes. When time comes for curses and pulling hair out, all right, in your group, keep these two things in mind. And it's going to come at some point. Bold leadership, here's two things. Bold leadership must be vision-based. Okay? It's very important. You anchor changes to a vision, because how severe the change is has to be matched to the clarity and connection to a vision. You understand what that means? If you come in and say, well, just because I said so, it's going to look like that you're trying to get power or control. If you anchor it to a standard, if you anchor it to a set, let me use church because it makes the most sense. If you're trying to be a visionary, and if you're trying to be vision-based and you need to come in and make some changes, you anchor it to what? Scripture. Right? This would be where you go like this. Yes. Because if you anchor it into, well, no, this is just what I think, and you'll do what I say, that's not going to work. If you anchor it into, we, after prayer and study, believe this is where God's word is leading us, then you're anchoring it into something that's a standard. Are you with me? Bold leadership must be vision-based. You see this. Nehemiah, if you look at verse 17 and 18 in chapter 13, he basically says, here's the Mark Killen version, wake up. You're neglecting the Sabbath. That's a big part of the reason the walls got tore down in the first place. If you keep doing this, God's just going to send another round of destruction. Don't you get it? Hey, wake up. God's going to send something that's probably going to tear the walls down and lead us all back into captivity again? Stanley says in his book, in this section, he says, to deliver on your vision, you must be willing to make bold and often unpopular decisions for the sake of what could and should be. Nehemiah couldn't just show back up and see all, let's go ahead and call it what it is. For them, it was sin. And go, it's okay, it's okay. Y'all are doing all right. No, they weren't. They were doing the opposite of everything. Here's the second one. Bold leadership must be vision-based. Bold action must be carried out against a backdrop of clearly defined beliefs and behaviors. And we've already been talking about that. Call people back to that standard like we talked about. When Nehemiah came back, he wasn't calling them back. It wasn't like this was anything new. It'd only been like 12 years. I mean, maybe some people had died in 12 years. I'm sure they had. But the majority of people, they knew who he was. They remembered the contract and the covenant and the standards that they agreed to. He's actually just calling them back to what they agreed to in chapter 9 and 10. It's like, hey, I mean, did he walk around and go, hey, wait, do y'all remember? Hey, remember signing this? Remember you agreed? So the last building block, and we're already hitting it on it with this, maintaining a vision requires bold leadership. Stanley gives the example of Jesus in Matthew 21, cleans out the temple courts, drives out the people buying and selling stuff. Jesus justifies his boldness in Matthew 21, verse 13, by saying it's written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, and you've turned it into a robber's den. He anchors his statement, Jesus does, to his Father's vision for the temple and in a belief as old as Isaiah himself. Now, here's the last thing I'm going to read you from this crazy little, that's not it, crazy little book, and then we're going to be done. These are tough 2 little paragraphs, all right? I'm going to go ahead and let me give you the precursor. I'm going to tell you that not everybody's going to like it, and that's okay. Nehemiah could have ignored the disobedience and the lack of respect for God's law, but what did he know that was ultimately going to lead to? If he ignored it, the whole nation was going back down the toilet, right? Sometimes leaders have to make hard and in some cases unpopular decisions. Here's the last 2 paragraphs of this chapter on bold leaders. Stanley says that Jesus knew what every visionary eventually discovers. Being nice doesn't always get the job done. And waiting around for people to catch on by themselves can sometimes be devastating to a vision. Eventually, there are trends that must be reversed, wrongs that must be righted, issues that must be resolved, and conduct that can't be tolerated. When problems surface, the leader must rise to the occasion and take decisive action. It's a good time for a Star Trek quote, isn't it? Y'all remember what Mr. Spock said in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan? I can't believe nobody remembers. He said the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And you're like, well, Mark, that's not a biblical principle. Jesus says to leave the 99 and go. I understand. That's talking about go after someone that's lost. This principle that I'm wanting to get you to think about is Nehemiah knew if he did nothing, the entire nation was going to be shot. Think about that. You're the leader. You're coming back. You left and everything was where God wanted it to be, moving in a good direction, following God's laws and God's decrees and commands, and things were good. You come back and it's not. How can you ignore that? If you're Nehemiah, what would you have done? Because he never loses sight of God, he is burdened with whatever is on him to get this back on track. whatever boldness that requires. I think it's important to remember, if you look at the last verse in chapter 13, he always takes it back. From day one, we talked about how he depended on God. He made a decision about the wall, but he didn't act for 4 months because he prayed. When the king said, you can go do it, before he went and did it, he prayed. Remember, everything went back to God. Everything went back to God. Sanballat's attacking him. It goes back to God. He ends the story with this: remember me with favor, O my God. Nehemiah was always taking it back to God. And I think, again, this story, again, is not about a wall. It's about getting a nation of people to be in the right relationship with God. If that took some of those people getting a little upset with Nehemiah, then so be it. As long as that relationship got back with God. Does that make sense? Are y'all with me about these last two building blocks, what it meant? We're out of time. It's 10:16. So we're done. Now let me tell you, we got some exciting stuff that's going to happen in here in the month of October. Next week is the kickoff of some good stuff. We're going to hear about a ministry happening right here in Florence called Common Ground Shoals. The directors of that ministry, Sky Stewart and Fabian Cortez, will be here in class with us. They're going to be up front here with me, and we're going to talk about what they're doing, who they minister to, and how they get how we can get involved, because in October our theme is going to be how you were made to make a difference. That's our theme. Now, that's going to lead us all the way up to Chosen Sunday, where we're going to talk about foster care and adoptions. Y'all with me? Common Ground Shoals next week. You were made to make a difference for a couple of weeks, leading us up to some interviews with some of our families who have adopted and fostered, all the way up to Chosen Sunday on November 6th. You with me? All right, thank you. You're dismissed.